I'll just say trigger warning for everybody listening, especially those in the children's and youth ministry trenches, because this is the norm, is to do a separate kids or youth worship hour, and we pull our kids out. Fundamentally, I think it's a major error because it's not scriptural. This one, I'll put a stake in the ground and say what we see from cover to cover of the Bible is the priority, the pattern, the principle of intergenerational corporate worship, literally from Old to New Testament.
Hey, friends, welcome to the Natasha Crane podcast. My guest today is Dr. Josh Mulvihill, and we have a conversation that I cannot wait to share with you about problems with today's kids and youth ministry. I know that sounds kind of negative up front, but I'm going to be honest with you. One of the biggest, most popular conversations that I am seeing between parents and grandparents and other stakeholders in the church today is what to do about kids and youth ministry, because there are a lot of challenges. We're not going to just talk about the challenges. We're going to talk about the solutions and what you need to be concerned with as a parent or grandparent or any other stakeholder in the church. So I'm really excited to share this conversation with you. A little bit of background on my guest. Dr. Josh Mulvihill is the executive director of church and family ministry at Renew a Nation. He served as a pastor for nearly 20 years and currently serves on the board at Awana. He holds a PhD from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and is the author of several books, including one that is especially important for our conversation today, called Family Ministry: How Your Church Can Shepherd Parents and Grandparents to Make Disciples. Josh is married to Jen, and they have 5 children. Before we jump into the interview, I want to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by Summit Ministries. Summit is an organization that for 60 years has equipped and supported rising generations to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. I think you guys know that now more than ever, our children need to be winsome and brave in the face of culture's lies. And as we're going to talk about in this episode, as parents, we know that we are the primary disciplers of our kids, and yet there are some really amazing opportunities to have others come alongside us in this journey of equipping our kids for today. And that's why I sent my own kids to Summit's in-person camps. They have camps in both Colorado and South Carolina where you can send kids ages 16 to 22. And they're 2-week summer camps where they get extensive worldview and apologetics training from top Christian thinkers and speakers. For younger kids ages 13 and up, they even have an online conference option now. So if you want to learn more about what Summit has to offer, go to summit.org/Natasha. And when you go there, you can learn more about all of the options that they have to offer. And if you sign up for an in-person conference by March 31st, you'll save $500 if you use my code Natasha26. From what they're telling me, the sessions are filling up really fast. Some of them are already 90% full. So if this sounds of interest to you at all, make sure you go and learn more. And again, go to summit.org/Natasha and use code Natasha26 for $500 off by March 31st. With that, here's my conversation with Dr. Josh Mulvihill. Josh, I want to start our episode by just making sure that everybody knows we are not here today to beat up on kids ministry or youth ministry or anything like that. Yes, the title of this episode is 7 Key Problems in Kids Ministry, and we're going to be talking about those problems and why they matter and what we should do. But at the same time, neither of us is opposed to kids ministry. In fact, both
Right.
of us have a heart for it as long as it's aligned with biblical principles. So let's start there. I would love to have you just share your own heart for kids ministry and youth ministry and why this is an important subject for you.
Well, I loved my youth pastor in high school. I went to a public high school, and the fellowship and the support that was had in my own youth group was foundational in my life, to the point that I went to Bible college and became a children's and youth pastor for about 20 years. So I've given my life to that, and it's been so fun to see so many young people that I've had the privilege of being part of their faith walk grow up to love and follow Jesus Christ, and then to see my own kids be impacted by children's ministry. All my kids went through Awana. We have a place in our heart and our family for Awana. Just they love scripture, of course, scripture memorization. And as a pastor, I did that at my church for about 10 years until I stepped out of that role. And now I have the joy of being on the board of Awana, and I get to be with some amazing team members that are at Awana. So love that organization.
Yeah, and we actually met in person. It was this last October when I was speaking at the Child Discipleship Forum, which is something that Awana puts on. So that's how we got introduced in person, and we started talking about doing an episode on kids ministry together. And when we were emailing about this, I was thinking there are a lot of different subjects, a lot of different ways that we could go with this. And so I just asked you, what do you think we should talk about? And it was awesome because you were so proactive and you responded and you were like, here are 7 issues that I see in kids ministry that we really need to talk about as a church and as parents, as grandparents. We need to understand these things and maybe better move our churches in a direction that align with biblical principles on these things. And so that's what we're going to do today is we're going to go through those 7 points that you brought up. But before we do that, I do want to talk about something briefly that you did mention in one of those emails, and that's that it's helpful to have the context of church history here. You said that there's been some kind of age based ministry in the church for over 500 years. And so it's really helpful for Christians to understand what that's looked like. And so we kind of see both the continuity and discontinuity with where we are today. So just give us a flyover of
Real
that in
quick one.
particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
real quick one. So we have some perspective before we dive into some of the issues that we're seeing today.
So often you'll hear some people say, well, children's ministry is not in the Bible, so it's not biblical. And sometimes I do think it's helpful to see that it has existed in church history for quite a long time, at least 500 years, but that has looked very different than it looks currently today. And so I'll walk through each of those 5. And what I think is helpful is just to see the church has seen value in children's and youth ministry for a very long time, but also the current form and shape that children's and youth ministry takes in the church has morphed over the centuries. And so we need to make sure that we're not just adopting a current form of ministry that we are seeing as sacred, that can't get changed or altered in any way. And often the shape that it has taken has been a reaction to what's happened in our culture and what's happened in the homes, and the church has adjusted to that. So back in the Reformation is when we first see this start. We call this the Catechism period. And theological giants like Martin Luther and John Calvin and Jonathan Edwards all had age-based ministries associated with their churches and their ministries. I mean, they even created tools and resources for what we would consider as children and youth ministry. It looked different, but they were catechisms. Luther's small catechism was one of those. And I really like this period in church history with how they did ministry, both in the church and in the home. What we end up seeing is that ministry is limited in nature with young people. They were always expected to be part of the broader church congregation, but there were times when they met separately by age group for instruction. And sometimes I think we even see individuals like Luther or Calvin doing the instruction. Could you imagine having like Martin Luther instructing your kids? Like, yes, I'd be up for that. That'd be pretty awesome. And one of the things that Calvin actually talks about in his book Institutes is that they would bring the youth before the congregation to be tested on their doctrine. And if they didn't do well, it showed that parents were neglecting teaching them in the home. And it actually says this should be a shame based kind of, essentially creates, parents are like held accountable on
Wow.
purpose. Like, could you imagine our churches doing that today? That
People would literally lose their
yeah,
minds
right.
if if anyone even suggested that. I mean, even if somebody went on X and said, "Hey, I'm thinking that we really should hold parents accountable publicly by whether or not their children can explain doctrine in front of the church," people would go nuts. That
Yeah.
is so interesting. I've never heard that before.
And so that lasted for about 300 years, and then in the early 1800s it shifted to a period of associations, and these would be groups of people that were committed to the same kind of mission. And we all know some associations. Probably the best known one that's still in existence is the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. It's not very Christian today, but it came into existence to provide some Christian community and Christian influence to young people that what ended up happening, this is the time of the Industrial Revolution. And so young people flocked to cities, they left their families. And what you see is this dying out, or this kind of the loss of influence of the family in the life of young people. And so these associations stepped in to kind of fill that gap. And the YMCA was one of those. And so the loss of influence of the family created this widespread need that was tried to fill. I mean, we tried to fill that through other avenues. And so literally the de well, the lack of parental engagement it's nothing new. I mean, this has literally been going on for hundreds of years that we have seen. There's nothing new in history. The way we have responded to that problem has been different. So there's different associations. We could create a list of many. Most are gone now. The third period was called youth societies. And what ended up happening, this would be kind of the late 1800s, the early 1900s. Our society was beginning to secularize. So societies, their main purpose was to encourage holiness and godliness through societies. There's pledges kind of came into existence in this time. Like there were temperance societies. You would sign a pledge not to drink, kind of like the purity culture. True Love Waits would be a similar version of that in the late 1990s. That kind of copied this model, and it really the purpose was to combat the erosion of Christianity and the decline that was happening of morality at this time. And then also in this period, there was a decision made by the Supreme Court in the late 1800s for taxpayer funded public education. And that was a game changer, because what you end up having now is the formation of adolescence that came into existence in our culture. And you have this demographic of teens now together that really didn't exist in that same form. And the church had to figure out in the late 1800s, well, there's this whole new kind of thing, this public education that's happening, that's clustering this age group together. How does the church respond to this? And so, teens wanted fellowship. They wanted togetherness. And so the church, they had to create some societies in essence to provide a kind of a Christian version of that. The fourth one is called relational outreach. This spanned most of the 1900s, from the 30s up to about the 90s, which starts to get into my era and maybe yours, I don't know. But this is the parachurch organization era, like Young Life and Youth for Christ and Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I was part of Student Venture, had a high school version, Campus Crusade had a high school version called Student Venture that I was part of in my high school. And these provided Christian fellowship in ways that sometimes we didn't get in other areas. And the focus was typically on evangelism. And so gone was a lot of your deep doctrinal training, and the focus might have been more on personal devotions. A lot was on discussion oriented, and terms like sponsors, which typically weren't parents, came into really strong prominence at this time. Um, Teens wanted to gather with other teens, but in a Christian environment. And then the present day is kind of a professionalized ministry. And so what was outside of the church in a parachurch format got brought into the church under the umbrella of church leadership, and it became professionalized by paid individuals. So obviously when you start a weekly program, that takes a lot of time and energy to manage that. And so we get paid staff in the last 40, 50 years that really didn't exist prior to this. And so then you have this period where what does it do in the perception of families when you have paid individuals who are supposed to work with children, which previously there were, but they were mostly lay people. They weren't paid, and oftentimes, they're individuals that had big hearts. Sometimes they were parents, sometimes they were. But what it did was the church became the experts then in child and youth ministry, creating the perception often that ordinary people, maybe even parents, didn't know how to disciple children. And it created a kind of a deferral culture to the discipleship experts with children. And what I think has ended up happening up to the present day, if we would say it's the parent's job to disciple the child, pretty much most, I would say 90 plus, high percentage, 90% plus of church leaders would nod their heads, say, yes, amen, preach it. We need parents to be engaged, discipling their kids. The problem is the actual function of the church oftentimes is sharing a different message. And so Awana actually did a study a couple of years ago and asked pastors and then parents, a couple thousand, whose job is it to disciple children? And the church leaders, pastors, it was predominantly like like 90, like almost 100%. It's the parents' job. Parents answered 51%. It's the church's job.
Wow.
It's the first time I've seen a study like that. Most of
Interesting.
the time, previously it was parents were saying, yeah, it's my job. What I think has happened is the present day perception has come into alignment with the current function of the church, where the church is essentially, I mean, think about our current, how much time, energy, and money that we as as an evangelical block, Christian block in America give towards children's and youth ministry. I mean, it's astounding the amount of energy we put into that. And that is going to create a culture and a perception. And I think we're seeing that with reality. So we just have to be aware of that. What is the next iteration of children's and youth ministry look like? I don't know. But I think as the family continues to break down, the church has a heightened level of importance. I think as as the society moves away from Christianity, and will mega churches even be possible in a country that continues to secularize and becomes less Christian? You have smaller congregations which tend to not have massive children's and youth ministry. They tend to be more parent-led kind of things. It'll be really interesting to see, I guess, in
Yeah.
20, 30, 50 years. So that's just helpful to know as we kind of talk through where we're at today.
That's really helpful. It's very interesting history, and as you're walking through those different periods, you can absolutely imagine how those things were impacted by the time and how they've impacted where we've gotten today. So that's really helpful background. So let's jump into these points that you sent via email that you're saying these are 7 key issues that you're seeing with where we are now. The first one that you named was theological famine of leaders. That's very strongly stated, and I could not agree more. So I would love for you to explain what you meant by that. You commented, according to research, and I think this comes from Arizona Christian University's Cultural
Yes.
Research Center under Dr. George Barna, only 13% of children's pastors have a biblical worldview. 13%.
Shocking, isn't it?
It's shocking. I talk a lot about the statistics and the research that comes out of Arizona Christian University on the podcast, so I think that most listeners have heard different parts of these statistics, but just to put that into some kind of context, according to the research, it's about 20%, maybe I'm off by a couple percent there, but it's about 20% of evangelicals who are in church on an average Sunday who have a biblical worldview. So that means that fewer children's pastors have a biblical worldview than people who are just sitting in the church.
And I don't know why that is. And I'm trusting that George Barna's work, who found this, he's very reliable. I've not seen anything that's problematic, so I trust those numbers. And so when you start asking George, like, what did you actually use to figure out that statistic? Like, what kind of questions did you ask to determine what a biblical worldview is? And a lot of it's just your basic core doctrines of that would be in most statements of faiths in conservative evangelical churches. And that's what he's saying a lot of our children's ministry leaders do not have. So that should be really alarming. And that's surprising, I think, to a lot of people to hear that. And what that means is, so first of all, don't assume that what is being taught and what is, the influence that's being had on a child is always a good biblical thing. And so basically, where your kids are, parents, you need to be. That's just, it's a basic principle of life where our kids are online, education, and in church. Don't just hand kids off and think this is, this is going to be a great outcome. Hopefully that's the case. But if George is correct with these numbers, everybody likes to think it's not me, it's not my church. Hopefully that's not the case, but it is a large percentage. Um, I'll also state here. So I was a young pastor. I became a pastor in my early 20s. I'm, I don't know if I would have been in this category. It'd be interesting to go back 20 years and young Josh. Hopefully not. But one of the things I found really helpful as a young pastor, there was a parent of teenagers in our church that came alongside me and mentored me. He put his arm around me essentially. He said, Josh, I want to build into your life. I want to speak into your life. And Chuck and I met every single month for years. Um, and and here's what I want to encourage you to do with the children's and youth ministry leaders, pastors at your church. Be a Chuck for them. Mentor them, build into them, help them develop their theology, their scripture. If they, like Chuck, I trust Chuck. I trusted Chuck. I was willing to talk with Chuck and just kind of share some of the challenges. I mean, it's hard to be a children's and youth pastor. You get beat up a lot. You get a lot of criticism. You're at the bottom of the pastoral totem pole in most churches. So to have somebody like Chuck that will come alongside and build into is great. So the key here for this one is mentor and monitor. Both are important. We don't want to beat up these children's and youth leaders, but we also do need to be realistic about where a lot of them are in their own walk with the Lord, and be engaged in a helpful way.
Yeah, if anyone is wondering more about those numbers, the statistics, if you're newer to the podcast and you're like, whoa, where did this come from? I did interview Dr. Barna on my podcast, and we talk all about the details of what questions are asked and their methodology. I will put
Mm.
a link to that episode in the show notes so that if you're really interested in that, you can go back to it. But his numbers, he's been doing research on biblical worldview for 40 years, and his numbers are kind of considered the gold standard in this area. So this is not just a random number that gets pulled off the internet somewhere. This is from a lot of research that's been done over many, many years. So I think that it is very telling, and I think that it's probably a pretty realistic number. Is it more like 15% or 10% rather than 13%? It's neither here nor there. I think the story is the same, that it's a minority, just like it is in the church, that very few people actually have a biblical worldview, meaning that they're seeing all of reality through the truth of what the Bible teaches. Now, some people might hear that and they might say, yeah, but volunteers are still being given a curriculum. For example, if you walk into a fourth and fifth grade classroom, for example, which I was volunteering in one a couple of weeks ago, if you walk in, there's going to be some kind of curriculum. So, how much does it matter that, the volunteer has a biblical worldview? Well, I would say it matters a lot, because so much of what comes out of the lessons is not just here's the curriculum and here's the verse we read. It's what the leader can add to it. It's sometimes how the leader can skew the teaching if they misunderstand the teaching themselves, so they can actually take away from the curriculum. So it's both what they can take away in a sense with their misunderstanding or misapplication, and it's also the opportunity cost of not being able to add to it as you might hope theologically. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, teachers are half of the curriculum or more. They
It's a
are.
good way of saying it.
Yeah, the teacher is the curriculum. So what's on a paper always gets altered, and that it's huge. We do need to be very mindful of the curriculum itself. But with this one, I would say have it as part of your hiring process. If as parents you can be part of the hiring committee, do a worldview assessment of your potential hires. So there are assessments out there. Renew Nation has one. We have a 30-question assessment. You can get a pretty good feel of where somebody's at and if they have some pretty big holes, and then utilize. Man, there's so many good resources out there that can be used to help supplement and train. Asha, your book Faithfully Different's phenomenal. You've got some, Natasha's got a bunch, but there are tons of others as well that get resources like that, put them in the hands of your leaders, and do a study and talk about it and help them learn. Those things they go a long way.
Along those lines, somebody had asked a question when I put on Facebook, I was interviewing you, and I said, does anyone have questions about a family ministry? And there were lots and lots of questions for you. And so hopefully we're going to have time to take a couple of those at the end. But there are some that were related to your 7 points here. So I might just intersperse them. And somebody said this: when the youth leaders have Marxist ideologies, feminist tendencies, or are far from the biblical conservative values, what do you do after talking to them, talking to the senior pastor, et cetera, but nothing really happens? They still have a leadership position. And I'll just say my answer to that person, I think that was the only person I directly responded to because it's such an easy answer for me, is that I would be out of that church because this is an example of how the teacher, you said it's half the curriculum, the teacher can become the whole curriculum, right? If that teacher wants to go against what the church values, if it wants to go against what the curriculum is teaching that the church has approved for the kids, and now they're actually just going their own way completely and they're teaching the opposite of what your kids should be learning. They're teaching these Marxist, godless ideologies at church. And you go to the pastor and you say, hey, this is what's going on. If the pastor doesn't care about that either, that to me is an easy, we need to leave the church. What say you?
Amen. We're
Okay, we're
gonna
aligned on that one.
Yeah, I think there's elder boards for a reason. I don't know what the governing structure is of your church. Our church has an elder board. Though that's a great, if it's like at that level, their job as elders is the doctrinal protection of a church. So that's elder level kinds of conversations. If not, and again, you want to do it graciously.
Yes.
You're gonna play that chip. That's kind of like everything's on the line chip. So do it wisely, do it graciously, do it with the health of the church in mind, and don't throw grenades. There's a lot of unhealthy ways things like that could be handled, but that's worthy of have those hard conversations.
And sometimes depending on who the leader is, they may not even realize that some of what they're teaching is unbiblical. We had an example of that with my kids in their youth group where they had someone who was not much older than they were at the time. I think they were in junior high and maybe this volunteer was in high school and she was helping to lead. And she didn't realize that this was problematic in some way, but she off the cuff just kind of mentioned, yeah, well, Paul was sexist. When he wrote his letters. And so that came back to me as the parent and, something that I addressed with the youth leader and said, hey, I think that maybe this person needs more mentorship and discipleship. Maybe they're not ready to be leading in the group. So like you said, do it graciously, but when it's a case where somebody maybe doesn't even realize the problem, it still has to be addressed. So whether it's intentional deception, you're out there pushing your Marxist ideologies, or it's unintentional, these are things that should be addressed. And hopefully people who are listening will want to step into that if these things come up. Okay, your second point: jurisdictional violation and role confusion. I love the terminology there. At first, I was thinking when I read that, wait, what does that mean? But then once you explained it, I was like, yes, this is a great term for this. So, what does that mean, jurisdictional violation and role confusion?
So, jurisdictional violation, God's created three institutions in our world: the church, the family, and civil government. And each of them in the Bible, he gives very distinct, specific roles and responsibilities to. So, this deals with spheres of responsibility. And we can have a jurisdictional violation when any three of those either abdicate or move into a role that's and usurp, and that's not theirs. And of course, when we operate in that way, it creates all kinds of chaos and problems. And so, specifically within the church world, the family tends to be the one that gets people usurp both the government and the church unintentionally, of course, wanting to help, but it demotivates then the family to do what God's called it to do. And so I thought it would be real helpful just to read a very specific example of this. 'Cause you say, well, that sounds really conceptual. Like, what do you actually mean? So I'll read an example. But I think in general, what's happened, like when you get to the actual function of the church, what this has meant is that the church has adopted a bit of an egalitarian theology applied to the role of parents and pastors. Meaning, if we'd say, what's the role of the church in the family? A lot of people say, well, that's discipleship. Like, okay, that's the same thing. That doesn't give us much distinction on differences. egalitarian theology is basically anybody can, there's no specific roles. And so we would say, yeah, it's ideal that parents disciple, but if that's not happening in their absence, we can insert a church leader, a pastor, and maybe another Jesus loving person can hopefully fill the gap. I think that's kind of an example of egalitarian theology. But I want to read you very specifically a jurisdictional violation. I'm not going to tell you the name of this person or the organization, but I will tell you this individual leads or led one of the largest children's ministry conferences in the country that trains thousands of children's pastors every year. And this is coming from that organization. So this isn't a minor kind of voice. It creates a kind of children's ministry structure philosophy that's shaping churches in by the thousands. So this is what this individual said. This is in relation to Deuteronomy 6. She said the main point of Deuteronomy 6 was that all of God's people are responsible for telling all of the children all about God. She goes on to say Deuteronomy 6 was not spoken to an individual family unit. It was spoken to the family of God. It was spoken to the nation of Israel as a collective mandate. It is not singularly the parents' responsibility, although they have a significant role to play. It is the entire family of God's responsibility. Now, I think that's a distortion of Deuteronomy 6, and I'll tell you why. Deuteronomy 6 does begin, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. That is a call to the entire nation of Israel. But then it goes from that point very specifically to a parent's job. Talk about these things at home, teach them to
Right.
your children. So that's a very specific sphere of responsibility. That's not somebody else's children, somebody else's home. And so when we get this jurisdictional responsibility wrong, man, it demotivates parents. And that wasn't said 10, 20, 30 years ago. That's recent. And so these are if children's ministry leaders are hearing this, parents abdicate and pastors usurp. And they think they're doing that in a way that's biblical when you hear things like that. And it is not. And so we need to be very clear. So I'll just ask a follow-up question with that. Um, do you know scripturally what is the biblical role of a parent? What is the biblical role of a pastor? How are they different? And how do we distinguish that? So I'll answer that own question. Everybody, I could leave it and leave you with a cliffhanger, but I'll answer that really clearly because we got to get to this level of specificity and clarity. Otherwise, you can't implement ambiguity, and that's what I think the church is operating according to a lot of times. So the one word that I think defines a pastor's role scripturally is shepherd. The one word that I think describes a parent's role scripturally is steward. Children, for you, Natasha, and for me, our children they don't belong to us, even though they share our last name. They're given us on loan by God to be raised for His glory. They belong to Him, and we are just, we're the stewards and the managers, but we are given a specific task to care for this incredible, incredible responsibility that God's given us. I have 5 of them, and so God didn't give that to a pastor, but God has given a role to a pastor as a shepherd that He hasn't given to parents. And so we have to have clarity, specificity around that. Otherwise, we get some role confusion. And I think the church is operating in that sphere at times.
It's such a good point, and it's something that a lot of people brought up on Facebook when they were offering questions and comments about this subject. A lot of people wanted to know, or they kind of assumed that, yes, it's a problem that parents are not more involved in discipling their kids. My audience tends to be a pretty active group, and so that's a question that comes up for them. They realize that's the role, but I think that what people see in their own church or maybe as volunteers in their youth ministry is that parents have abdicated the role, and it's very hard to get them back on board either to first acknowledge that, yes, this is primarily my responsibility, or once they've acknowledged that, to get them to act on it, to execute. So, do you have any thoughts before we move on to your third point about how do you get more parents involved? Because I know that's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an entire book on this because it's
Awesome. Tell us about
critical.
it.
Yeah, it's called Family Ministry: How Your Church Can Shepherd Parents and Grandparents to Make Disciples. And it literally is it's a cookbook. I mean, it's here's the ingredients, 9 biblical principles, characteristics of a vibrant family ministry. But I will say this, a lot of church leaders think I need to put a resource in a parent's hand or teach a training thing, and those are really helpful. There's a percentage of parents that they need the how to, they need the skill set, they'll be off and running. I think a large percentage of parents today, it's not because of a lack of how to for most parents. I mean, there's you and I can go on YouTube and find a million podcasts, and we can find the how to. We live in an information age. So I think it's deeper than that. I think the predominant issue for a lot of parents is a heart issue. And this is where Deuteronomy 6 starts. It doesn't start with the how to. It doesn't start with teach these things and talk about them. It starts with love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And so I think the main issue for a lot of parents is they have the wrong affection. They don't love the Lord their God with all their heart. They love him with some of their heart. And they are not going to, by nature, if we love God, it is our passion. We're going to want to help our kids do the same. And we're going to say, all right, I am motivated to do that. Help me, pastor. But if that love's not there, we can put all the books in the world in front of them. We can give all the how to's, and it's not going to move the needle. So I would say, church leaders look to the heart, start there. Is their love off? And honestly, we don't talk about this in the with parents, but sometimes they need a kick. We want to coddle them. Sometimes they need a kick in the pants, and sometimes it's disobedience that they know what they need to do, and this is an admonition kind of thing that needs to come from a church leader. Obviously, there needs to be a relationship there. It needs to be done in love. But we've lost that whole side of things to just thinking, man, if I do this, if I give this resource, do this training, it's going to move. And it will. I think there's, a percentage that's needed, but I'll give that whole spectrum.
So good. And I could not agree with you more. There are so many resources out there to help parents. So if a parent is truly motivated and they're like, yes, I know that my primary responsibility is to raise my kids to know and love the Lord, and this is something that I know is in a priority and it's urgent, they're going to find the way to raise their kids with this understanding. And there's so many resources for that, but it's at the interest level. I think it's generating the interest in the first place and getting parents to a point where they're thinking, yes, this is relevant and necessary. And so we should be asking ourselves as a Christian, what stops you from thinking it's relevant and necessary to disciple your kids actively? Well, here's the answer to it. And it goes right back to the Barna research, where you have 65% of Americans who self identify as Christians. Many of those go to churches and have their kids in kids ministry, but only 4% overall across the population have a biblical worldview. So we were talking about 13% of children's pastors, but in the population overall, it's about 4%. So if you put all that together, you realize that in the church, you're going to have lots of families, parents who don't have a biblical worldview, knowingly or not, and they're sending their kids into kids ministry. And then well-meaning leaders are saying, hey, parents, we really want to make sure you're discipling your kids. Let us resource you and give you all these things. But the parents themselves don't have a biblical worldview. They don't, like you're saying, they don't have a heart for the Lord necessarily. Maybe they don't have a biblical worldview because they think, well, at the end of the day, no one really knows what's true. Or, at the end of the day, I think that pretty much everyone goes to heaven. I mean, there can be so many misconceptions that lead to you not having a biblical worldview that then translate into you not caring enough to disciple your kids. And I think overwhelmingly that is the problem in the church, is that if you don't have parents with a biblical worldview, they're not going to be discipling their kids for any number of reasons. So we've got to have the trickle down effect that churches have to better disciple adults into having a biblical worldview in every area. That is going to translate into parents caring enough to then grab the resources that leaders are going to put into their hands. That brings us to your third point, replacement ecclesiology. Another great term. I love this. And you said the norm is for kid men to replace corporate worship. And this is a major error for the church, is what you wrote to me. Why is it that you believe children's ministry should be a supplement and not a replacement?
This is, I'll just say, trigger warning for everybody listening, because especially those in the children's and youth ministry trenches, because this is the norm, is to do a separate kids or youth worship hour, and we pull our kids out. Um, Fundamentally, I think it's a major error because it's not scriptural. This one, I'll put a stake in the ground and say what we see from cover to cover of the Bible is the the priority, the pattern, the principle of intergenerational corporate worship, literally from Old to New Testament. That's the primary reason we do it. And so I'll just give you a few examples, Natasha, and for everybody listening. I'll pick a couple of my favorite verses. So Joshua 8:35 says this. It says, there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and the children. So not a word, not a word in all of that Moses had commanded. I tend to think that that's the first 5 books of the Bible. You could make a case that maybe it's the law contained within those 5 books, but regardless, it's a lot. And this makes the case that even children, it means literally those unable to march. This is little kids. They were present. They were listening. And sometimes we say, kids can't sit for long periods of time and handle hard topics and big things. Well, you see the exact opposite right here. Psalm 148:12 says this: young men and maidens together, old men and children, let them praise the name of the Lord. That kind of this theology of togetherness is it's a buzz thing right now, a buzzword to talk about intergenerational stuff and multi-generational. Well, God's created that. We don't need to fabricate it. It's called corporate worship. It is a togetherness that is to happen every single week. And then the last one I'll mention, this is Ephesians 6:1. We are all probably as parents familiar with this passage. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Just want to call the attention that this passage is a direct statement to children. So that means children were part of the congregation. And as this letter was read, children, hey, pay attention. I've got something to say to you. Obey your parents in the Lord is kind of the equivalent. And the reason that matters, you not only were children present, but you think about what is contained in the book of Ephesians theologically. It's some big weighty things, and it was just, again, the norm that kids were part of that. You think about the first chapter of Ephesians, and it deals with being ordained by God and predestination and election conversations, and that makes our heads hurt as adults, but yet here kids are part of that. That obey your parents in the Lord is also almost verbatim in the book of Colossians. Again, think about the big theological topics that are there. This is just the norm, cover to cover, all generations worshiping together. And so that we moved out from this a number of decades ago as this being the norm. My grandparents and even my parents, when I talked to those generations, their norm was corporate worship. And we moved away from that kind of in my generation and later. That now that's not the norm. But let me give this example. And here's what I think it's comparable to. Corporate worship I compare to like a family dinner at church. And if we compared it to family dinner in our home, what would be the impact on our children if we had a kids table for worship for our meal and an adult table, kind of like we often do at Thanksgiving? But we did that every meal with our family. Like, could you imagine what would the impact on your family be, Natasha, if your kids had their own table for dinner every night and you and your husband did? And we even use some of the same kind of logic, like, I just need a break from my kids. I get more out of my dinner when when I don't eat with my kids. It's just me and
Right.
my husband. And like, those are the things we say about corporate worship. Um, I don't doubt you get more out of it personally, and it is good to have a break from your kids once in a while, but that's not the place or the time to do that. And so, What I would encourage you as a family is to prioritize corporate worship on Sunday morning. And you know what we've done with our church is we have 2 hours on Sunday morning. We're a large enough church that we do that. And so we encourage our families to worship one and then serve or go to class a second. So it's not an either or, it's a both and for our families. And it takes a little bit of education and training. But I did this really easy as a pastor. It really wasn't, we didn't even preach a sermon. We didn't, it's pretty simple. I literally bought 200 copies of a book called Parenting in the Pew by Robbie Castleman. It's kind of a nuts and bolts thing. Printed up an article by John and Noel Piper about of families worshiping together. I wrote literally like a paragraph note to families, and I literally stuck those in the book. And sent out an email and said, first 200 families gets a copy free. Boom. That was it. That was all we did. We moved 400 grade school age kids from our classrooms to corporate worship, and they still continued to attend our age-based programming, but they did more. That happened in 3 weeks, and it hasn't changed in 15 years at our church. To the point now that our church actually no longer even offers middle school or high school programming on Sunday morning. We got rid of it altogether. So if you're in sixth grade or older at our church, there is no other option for you but to come to church and worship corporately. We have, all the midweek Wednesday kinds of things for students, but we have gotten to that point as a church, kind of forcing parents' hands. And of course, that's a big change for a lot of churches. It's a big change for a lot of families, but it's a good thing.
That's a great case study of how it can be done because I think a lot of people probably think, "Oh, man, this would be impossible to implement in our church." People would, people would go crazy about it. But you're saying, "Hey, no, we made it work in a big church," and so I think that's really helpful for people to hear. Let's say that somebody is listening to this though, and they totally agree with you. They're on board. They wish that their kids were in church with them, but that's not how their church is currently set up other than obviously raising the concern and talking to maybe leadership about it and seeing what kind of changes might be made. If somebody's in a church like that, would you go so far as to say, go find another church where they're doing this differently? And
Not
if not, what
necessarily.
would you recommend they do while staying at the church? Would you tell them, pull your kids out and just forego the kids ministry completely so that they are in church? How would you navigate that for people who don't have that circumstance right now?
That's a great first step. Just start attending with your kids. And it's interesting what happens. I would have a conversation with whoever's in leadership. And, what I encourage church leaders to do if a church only has 1 hour on Sunday, is cancel your programming on Sunday morning up to about 5 years old. Offer to up to about 5 years old and cancel it everything after that. So you force your families to attend. Ideally, you'd have 2 hours or more, and then you can do some version of both, and then families don't feel like they're put in this situation. But yeah, if you're a family and you're a parent, and you're saying, "Man, my church just isn't on board with that," just bring your kids in with you. If a pastor at that point says they're not allowed, then that would be an issue where I'd say, okay, this probably isn't the church for us. Then, if that's literally anti children in corporate worship to that degree. And, um, you know, but most churches aren't going to get to that point where they say your kids can't come in at all. And what ends up happening, other families are going to take note. They're going to notice. They might ask you why, and it might give courage for others to start doing the same.
Yeah, and I think the why is very important to people, right? Because if you haven't been thinking through why we're having kids involved in the church, you're just going to be annoyed when there are disruptions, right? Because you're just thinking, why did they do it like this? I can't hear the sermon. This kid is like moving around behind me, and I just confess I am super bothered by like kids going crazy around me. And so that is a weakness of myself, but I absolutely see the value in what you're talking about, but I think that's why it is so important that if a church was moving toward this, that you have to educate people and you have to get them thinking about why this matters, why it's so important, because otherwise people are only thinking about how it's affecting them and not necessarily the whole church community. So I really appreciate what you said there. Well, your fourth point was attractional entertainment. I think we all know if you've had kids in church ministries, you know what this means. But elaborate on that. What's the problem with attractional entertainment?
Fun, fun, fun. It's kind of your Disney-like mentality applied to children's ministry. It's kind of your church growth model, and it's well known in the church growth world that the children's ministry is a key driving engine to generate growth of the church. Um, I want to give you some examples of what this looks like in real life. So, our church, one of the ones that I was a pastor at quite a while ago now, we had a change in leadership and a new executive pastor came in. And this is an exact quote that he said to me. He said, "Josh, I know you love all that truth stuff, but what I need from you is for you to design programs that will attract families to help our church grow." Like, you don't usually see it bared that clearly,
Wow.
but he said that, and I knew immediately, I'm done at this church. The the difference philosophically and theologically
Yeah.
is so distinctly different. I am gonna probably get fired if I stay here because I'm not going to function this way. But you see this, it's kind of, it's the idea that if you do certain things, your church will grow. It's kind of a seeker model, and the scripturally, the true seeker is Christ. He came to seek and to save the lost, not doing that through all these creative kinds of growth engines in the church. But I want to, this is alive and well still today in the children's ministry world. I'm grateful for many others, Awana included, that are pushing back against this philosophy to help groups have a discipleship mindset, not an attractional mindset. But here, I want to just give you two examples of what this looks like. There was an article recently that I ran across by a fairly well-respected individual in the children's ministry space, and this is the title of his article: "The Chuck E. Cheese Church Growth Strategy for Your Children's Ministry." Like, and tons of people, I'm sure, read that and were thinking this is a good, helpful thing. One, I won't say this person's name either, or the ministry he's associated with, but this individual has a massive conference as well that trains thousands of children's pastors every year. And this was one of the things he shared on social media. "Visiting families at your church want to know their kids are safe and having fun. Make those a priority and ministry opportunities open up wide." Of course, all of us want to have safe kids. That's super important in the day and age we live in. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna say that is important, but the having fun piece, like, where's Jesus there? Where's the Bible? Like, that is just indicative of a lot of what children's ministry is. It's the fun in the games, and what do parents often say the first thing when they come pick their kids up from a youth or children's ministry?
Fun.
Did you have fun? Yeah, like. So here's the key question with this one for you as a parent with your church. What's your church's philosophy of children's and youth ministry? If it's that attractional entertainment kind of model, you're getting a really shallow teaching. There's obviously some scriptural stuff there, but it's just not at the depth that I think is going to be really, really helpful for most kids long term in their faith. And so this is one that, do you have any influence in the church to impact the way the church ministers to the next generation? Or you find a church again that is just has a different philosophy in its approach to the next generation?
I think it's important for people to remember it, and I mean, I don't know if people think that they can compete on fun, but I'm going to make the bold claim that the church can't compete on fun per se, because especially when you get to, teenagers, for example, there are so many things competing for their time and attention that if your focus is on providing fun, you're probably not able to compete with their definition of fun on multiple levels. So if that's what you think that you're doing in your youth ministry, you're going to fail because you're never going to be as fun as the fun that they think they're going to be having in other places. And so it doesn't work on multiple levels. It's the wrong approach biblically, but it doesn't even work in a practical sense. Now, that said, I think you would probably agree with me, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not bad to include fun when the primary purpose is truth and discipleship, and that is why you're attracting people. I think that there are things obviously that youth groups can do and kids ministry can do that do encourage kids to come. And I have a little bit of a softer softer spot for that than I used to. I think that when my kids were little, I was like, no, they need to be hardcore. They need to be focused. They need to be learning these, big questions and answers and, get rid of the fun you're just taking away from any of the time that they could be learning truth. And I think as I've gotten to have older kids now, I have three teenagers, 17, 17, and 14. You start to see the dynamics of older kids and how they're processing these things and what can maybe put them over the edge a little bit in terms of going to youth group in a given week. And those things aren't bad. Those things can be good to help get kids there. You just want to be sure that your program is not primarily focused on that that's not the central driver, that it is about truth, because that's what the church has to compete on with your time. If you want to learn more about the nature of reality, the truth about this world and why you should believe that's true and what that means for your life, come to church. We'll have some fun while you're here, but that's why we're getting together. Would you agree?
I would agree 100%. Yeah, and that's why I ask what's the philosophy, the foundation. Obviously, some funds nobody has a problem with that. That's a secondary thing, but when it is like the core driving
Yeah.
piece, yeah, no.
Yes. Well, that gets us to your next point of Bible light moralism. And this kind of gets to the content that when kids are there, when you get them to church, what are they actually being taught? And I think what you're saying here is that it's really just this moralistic version of the Bible rather than the Bible in its fullness.
Yeah.
So help us understand your concerns about that.
So a lot of kids aren't being taught a biblical worldview. They're not being taught how to think scripturally about pick your subject matter. Kids, they know Bible stories. They know about Daniel and the lion's den. They know about David and Goliath. Pick your Bible story. But the challenge we're seeing in our culture today is that's not where their faith is being attacked. It's being attacked at the core doctrinal level. So that's where, we used to think, well, this is really important. We can wait till their teenage years until we get really serious about that stuff. But this is, I mean, if your kids have any access to a screen today, if they sit down in any educational setting, they're getting doctrinal kinds of things and worldview kinds of teachings in so many different ways. You're really good at this, Natasha. You could probably give some wonderful examples in this area, just the kinds of things kids are being hit with in our culture today. But what we need churches to do, the teaching that happens in the classroom at churches, it needs to address the origin kinds of things, the humanity, identity things, the sexuality, marriage, world religion kinds of I mean, there's so many different things that churches could do. And of course, you do it in an age appropriate way. But if we're just teaching through scripture, this starts to become more natural, and there's so many opportunities for this to occur. So, what is an example of this? I would say think Veggie Tale esque. And that's like obviously on one far end of the spectrum. That's very moralistic with kind of a nugget of scriptural truth in there, but it doesn't get to the depth that kids are needing to understand and defend their faith, and that's what they need today. You could say a lot about this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, that's a bit of what I talked about actually when I was at the Child Discipleship Forum and talking about what kids need today for a confident faith. And I kind of go through four areas of, it's what the Bible teaches, why believe it, what other people believe, and how to answer challenges. And so obviously I could speak for an hour on all those, but those are kind of the different areas. I think the biggest challenge though, when I speak on this topic is that people will always ask, well, okay, so how do you execute that? And the problem is that yes, you could have ideally some kind of curriculum to guide teachers in delivering that content. But back to your very first point, if the teachers aren't grounded themselves, if they don't have a biblical view and they don't understand this, there's only so much they can do to pass the content on. So to me, it comes back to teacher training. What are you doing to help the teachers who are in your churches to be able to deliver this content well and to grow themselves spiritually so that they can then pass that on? It's a very circular problem. And with that in mind, I know a lot of people are wondering, and some of the people were asking on Facebook, they said, somebody just put it this bluntly, is there even such thing as a good Sunday school curriculum? What do you say to that? Is there such thing as an ideal curriculum that, okay, maybe not ideal, but if a teacher maybe doesn't have all the training that they can just walk in and actually equip kids in a better way than just the Bible light moralism that you're concerned about?
Well, I'll just share the couple that I've used as a pastor. So I've used Awana's curriculum and I love it. I think it's phenomenal. Awana has both a Wednesday and a Sunday morning option. The Wednesday option is you'll never hear Awana say this, but it's essentially a catechism, and that's why it does so good because it crosses over to the home, and it teaches your core doctrines, kind of your basic truths that we want all kids to understand. Awana has added what's called Bright, which it teaches more of a biblical theology through the storyline of Scripture, and teaches kind of your core pillars of a biblical worldview: creation, rebellion, salvation, restoration. It's kind of built around that. And then I also used Marty Machowski has a curriculum called The Gospel Story, which I used as a pastor on Sunday morning. Bright didn't exist back in the day. It's come out in the last few years, but that was my biblical theology version. I think that's helpful. We need kids to have a kind of a general understanding of the overview of Scripture. I think that's helpful too about the early grade school years, first, second grade. And then you really need to transition to some of your core doctrinal kinds of teachings and biblical worldview kinds of training. We have some at Renew Nation as well. And one of the things we are working on right now, we're creating a biblical worldview curriculum for the church that teaches topics that children's ministry curriculums don't typically touch, like things like environmentalism, things like education. How do we think about that scripturally? Things like justice, things like race, and topics that our kids they're dealing with on a regular basis in our culture. But because tends to be more the church tends to be more pietistic and spiritual, salvation kind of focused, which those are critical areas, of course, but they don't hit that's actually our next point. They don't hit the fullness of some of the issues that our kids need to know to stand firm in their faith. And so, but yes, there's some great ones out there. If you are able to even write your own curriculum as a church, I honestly think that's the best possible place to be because it's specific to your congregation in your local church. And that takes a lot of work. That's why a lot of people don't do it. But if you're a pastor, as a pastor, you're expected to preach weekly. And that when I went into the pastorate, that was my expectation was I'm going to be preaching 40 to 45 times a year, whether that's with a specific age group or a congregation. And that's one of the calls on a shepherd is to be able to teach. And so in the children's ministry world, we've kind of gotten away from that thinking, I don't teach, I buy curriculum. And if you can you can teach, you can write curriculum, do that. I think that's the ideal place to be. And it's going to be specific to your congregation.
Well, I know people will appreciate the recommendations that you mentioned. I'll be sure to put links to those in the show notes. So if anyone's listening there and they're thinking, "Wait, what did he say again?" I'll put that in the notes for the show, so you can go back to that. Now, you started to mention this, so this is kind of a continuation of that point. But your sixth point was what you said is a truncated gospel. I thought this was really interesting because I have not been close enough to kids ministry to see this particular point, but you said kids are taught rebellion and salvation, but not creation and restoration. This is very interesting to me. Explain.
Yeah, and that is happening in part, but not in total. So I'd say the primary focus of a lot of what happens in the children's and youth ministry arena, we talk about the problem of sin and the salvation, the gospel message in Jesus Christ. Obviously, that's the core. That's the most important. Not diminishing that in any way. But when that becomes the kind of the main totality, and we don't expand into the other areas, we're not teaching the whole counsel of God's word to our kids. And so where the action is in our culture today is often in the creation topics and the restoration topics. So let me tell you what I mean by that. What our kids are hit with is gender identity, sexuality, LGBTQ, wrong views, of course, marriage, sanctity of life, race issues. Those are all creation topics that we see right out of the gate in Genesis. Oftentimes, sometimes we'll get origins. Oftentimes, you will in children's ministry curriculum, but a lot of those other ones sometimes aren't even present, and so it just leaves this void that kids aren't getting in core teaching. And then on the other end, in the restoration, this is where we all know there's problems in the world. What's God's solution to bring restoration to all creation? And so you see, our world gives all kinds of statist, totalitarian, kind of Marxist, or even other world religion. These are all solutions to the problems that are seen in our world, and I think that's captivating to kids sometimes. Like you even look at the statistics of the kind of the teens, young adults that are open to socialism in our country today. It's like 50%. It's like shocking because I think they're seeing our world's broken, and the economic climate of our society seems unattainable for a lot of young people. So, what's the solution? Well, I'm never going to have the American dream, and there is no way to solve the problem. So, we want the collective to do this, not the rugged individual. You see this, of course, in New York. I'm from Minnesota. We've got all kinds of problems in our state with this, and so that's captivating to young people. So we have to teach them what's God's solution to sin in a broken world. That's revelation. You see at 21, no more tears, no more pain. This is hope. Our kids are dying for hope. All the suicidal stuff, all of the depression, the anxiety, these are all symptoms of this greater issue. And so we want to give our kids this vision for how, we've lost the reformational perspective of a vocation as ministry, and God using children wherever they're at in this world as a means of ministry to repair the brokenness in just that little sphere. We could tease it out in a lot of ways, but we need to give that full orbed creation, rebellion, salvation, restoration worldview to kids. And when we don't talk about the two ends of that spectrum and just focus so heavily on rebellion and salvation, we're kind of shortchanging them. So don't hear me, that it's all. I always get a little nervous saying those things because this, a liberal church, liberal theology has turned that into social justice and has made it not about the gospel in doing that. So that's the danger in going that route. But there is still I think the gospel. It's a fullness of the gospel filling out in all spheres.
That is just so brilliant. I love everything you just said because it is just so true. And I think what happens is if kids are only getting the middle two portions of this about the rebellion and the salvation, it feels, even though it shouldn't be, but without more context, it feels to them disjointed from these other things that you're talking about. It's gender and sexuality and the status solutions, all of the things that you just discussed. Those things have to it's part of discipleship. In fact, this is a whole topic of an episode that I've been wanting to do where I just wanted to explain why I think that cultural issues have to be part of discipleship because for a lot of Christians that they just seem like tangential things and I'm going to just focus on these basic things over here. But if you have the fully orbed picture like you're talking about from creation to restoration, then that fits right into it. And I'm glad that you pointed out when you say creation, you're not just saying, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth because you're going to get that in church, right? But when you're talking about creation issues, it's talking about identity, it's talking about anthropology, right? And what is a human being? And if we get that wrong, we're going to get everything else wrong. You're going to start thinking that people are fundamentally good, like the research shows most Christians actually believe. And then it starts to get into, well, do you even need a savior? And, maybe we can save ourselves. Oh, wait, maybe the state can save us. You go wrong completely start to finish if you get the anthropology wrong in the creation story. So that's such an important point to make.
Yep.
And you're right, like the socialist thing and how many young people are open to that, they're not even seeing that as a matter of worldview. That's a huge issue, right? They don't even see why political systems have anything to do with their Christian beliefs. In fact, they probably think the warmth of collectivism, right? As new Mayor Mamdani talked about it. And they're thinking it's a good thing we're helping people, right? But they don't understand that the underlying worldview of that is one that assumes many things about the nature of a human being and the nature of government and the nature of God, really, the existence of God. So there's a lot that can be done there. In fact, I'm going to be, my next episode is going to be with Heidi St. John, and we're going to be talking
I
about
love
why
Heidi.
America
Yeah.
is worth saving from progressives, socialists, and communists. And we're going to be talking about exactly these issues. So if anyone's interested in that subject, I encourage you to look out for that next episode.
Yep.
Let's end with this one, your seventh point: lack of a biblical vision for family. I mean, in a sense, even though this is coming last in the conversation, this underlies everything, right? If you don't have a biblical vision of family for your church, it's going to affect everything else you do. So, what do you have in mind with this one?
I often ask pastors to raise their hand when I'm teaching them, training them. Raise your hand if your church has a theology of the family. If you've ever kind of written that out or established that, over the years, very, very few hands have gone up. And of course, most pastors would have the basics that are present, understand a biblical view of marriage and children are a burden, not, or a blessing, not a burden. Some of those basics, but a full developed theology of the family is absolutely critical. Most churches have a theology of worship, theology of missions, a theology of preaching. Fill it out. But why that becomes important, that is the foundation for the whole institution of the family. The role, what is the purpose of the family? What's the role of a grandparent? What place does education have in a child's life? What is the connection of the family to the Great Commission? We can ask all these questions, and some pastors will not be able to answer those kinds of what I would think are pretty basic questions um, with clarity. And so, if this is not true for your church, and the fact that you don't have a theology of the family, I think there's a simple activity that can be done. Simply get a piece of paper and bullet point out on a single piece of paper, just one piece of paper, the key passages of scripture and maybe a sentence that summarizes it. What is that biblical principle? And that gives us some clarity around the role of the family and God's vision for the family. And family ministry is an essential for every single church because it is connected to the gospel itself. You see this in it's Acts 2:39, which literally the early church launched with a multi-generational family discipleship vision, and most churches skip this. Acts 2:39 says this is for you, for your children, and for all who are far off. There's three spheres of gospel movement there. And we often miss that middle one. It's often for you and for those who are far off. So a lot of churches go directly from evangelism for adults or whoever they're ministering to directly to across the street and around the world. But the movement of scripture is at home, then across the street, and then around the world. And we see that in the Bible. So your church does need a plan. How are you going to equip parents? How are you going to equip grandparents to do what God has called them? I like to ask parents, if your children, I've got two that are in college, and so we've a lot of the foundational teaching with them has occurred. Where you still parent because that never ends, but it takes a different shape. But if all your children knew when they were 18 was what you taught them, how would you be doing as a parent? That's a really convicting question for a lot of parents. Don't rely on the church or an educational setting to be that primary voice. I am so grateful for the impact that our church and others have had on my kids, but that's supplemental. It's cherry on top stuff. It's not the primary kind of influence in their life. And if we're operating like that's going to be the case, there's going to be so many gaps and there's going to be so many opportunities for erroneous, untrue, unbiblical kinds of seeds to take the root in our kids' hearts and minds that could germinate into all kinds of erroneous things. So Help your church have a biblical vision for the family. It's strategic, you know, not even looking at what scripture says, but it's strategic in the sense that when we when we help a parent capture a vision for family discipleship, the amount of time that they get with their kids dwarfs what anybody else has with a child. And so that turns, as a pastor, I'd get an hour or two a week with a young person. Parents, the average dad spends 7 hours a week. The average mom is 13. So 20 hours. That can become a really impactful 20 hours week after week after week after week. And then when I get them in a classroom on a church standpoint, it's adding to what's primarily already happening at home. When we get truth, God's truth taught well in the different spheres, church, home, education, we think at Renew Nation that's a three-stranded cord that's really hard to break in a young person's life. But when it's not happening in the home, it's really tough to make up that ground in other areas. So what? How are you doing in your job? Mom and dad at home with your kids. Take that seriously, and I trust that God will bless the work that you do with your kids.
That is a great final word to parents listening, and I think you've given so much to think about. I think that people will hear all of this and have a lot to consider about their own families, and so really appreciate all your time. And I could talk to you a lot more about all of these subjects. And in fact, we had a whole bunch of questions that people wanted you to answer online, but we're out of time. Can I ask if you'd be willing to come back another time so we can do a part two and we can take
Sure,
some of those
yes.
questions?
Those were good questions. I saw some, I was like, "Oh, yeah, those are fantastic."
They're
So, yes, that'd
really
be fun.
good. Well,
Yeah.
that would be great. So I will definitely have Josh back on if you're listening to this and you're like, "But we had all these questions." We will get him back on. We'll do a part 2 about family ministry, and we will take a bunch of those questions. And, as everyone can hear, you have a wealth of wisdom and knowledge on this topic, so I'll really look forward to that. And if people want to learn more about your resources and what you're doing and your podcast, all the things, where should they go to find out more?
Main site is renewnation.org. And if you're in the church world, we have one for pastors called familyministry.org. And then we have a podcast, me and my wife. It's super fun, The Gospel Shaped Family. So you could check that out.
And I encourage all of our listeners to check out those resources. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you guys for listening today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with somebody you know and rate or review the podcast on your player. It helps more people to find out about the show. Thanks so much.